Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. I went in too hard with that intro there. How is everyone doing? How are you all? I just made the mistake of watching part of Katie Britt. Is that her name? Senator Katie Britt from Alabama. Her rebuttal to the State of the Union. And it was maybe one of the most unhinged political performances I've seen in a while, but you could see right under the skin, you could see what a cruel lunatic she is. And I was trying to figure out, I'm like, oh, when real fascism pops off here. I mean, it's pretty fashy here in America right now. But when it really pops off, I was trying to figure out which Nazi would she be. I think Ilsa Koch. That's my guess. That was one of those Nazi wives that was like a fucking sadist. Anyway, you can watch it online if you are wondering what I'm talking about and you haven't seen it. It's truly, truly psychotic. But you know what is not psychotic? The absolute opposite of psychotic? Today's episode. Because today I'm talking to Dan Abnett, and goddamn is he wonderful. If you don't know who Dan is, I'm going to read you his bio right now. Originally from Maidstone, and you'll hear why in this episode. Please update Dan's Wikipedia. But originally from Maidstone, 7 times New York Times bestselling author and award-winning comic book writer Dan Abnett began working in the editorial department of Marvel UK before starting to write his own comics. Dan's CV is too extensive to cover here, but a highlights reel includes his incredible work for 2000 AD, which includes comics such as Sinister Dexter and Brink, his revamp of the Guardians of the Galaxy with writing partner Andy Lanning, which became the basis for the MCU films, his work with Lanning on The Authority, which might be the first time I read him, his work on Warhammer 40K, and my personal favorite, his Wilds End books, which are some of the best comics I've read in forever. Like I said, goddamn, Dan is a delight to talk to. We get into so much, including his childhood, obviously. That's the thrust of the show. But also, we talk a lot about craft and then how certain ways he orients himself or directs himself in the way he writes, how a lot of those things led back to childhood stuff, or just to, as you'll hear, to just ways that Dan's brain is set up. That's somewhat cryptic. You'll hear what I'm talking about in this, but I hope you like this episode. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Please read Dan's books. If you haven't read Wild's End, fantastic. Brink, brilliant. Check that stuff out. And while you're checking stuff out, why not check out other episodes of Beginnings? If this is your first episode, welcome. Hey, if this is your 624th episode, welcome. But if this is the first time you are listening to the show and you're like, oh, I like this, what I like to do here in the beginning is a little recommended. If you like, I've been doing the show over 14 years. That's a lot of episodes to wade through. So why don't I recommend some based on today's guest? Okay? Dan, comics writer. What about other comics writers I've had on the show? Kieran Gillen, Jeff Lemire. This is just recently, last couple years. Matt Fraction, Greg Rucka, Kelly Thompson, Chip Zdarsky. That's just a handful. Did I say Jim Starlin? I think that was last year. So check out those episodes. If you like what you hear, why not subscribe to the show? Why not leave a review on Apple Podcast? Can you do it? You can just click things on Spotify. What else can I tell you? I'm on... I laugh every time now. I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Blue Sky at Andy Beckerman. Which one is worth it? Maybe Instagram, maybe Blue Sky. What else? Coming up on the show, I just talked to Linda Smith, a pioneering voice in the bedroom pop movement. Began making tapes in the 80s, distributed through K Records. I guess the equivalent in England would be maybe C86. Well, we had a great talk. That's next week, so stay tuned for that. But for now, let's talk to Dan. Well, not always, but
there we go.
I don't know why I had to qualify that. You know what? I used to be a philosophy professor, and I taught logic, so my brain has been frozen in that forever, in which I can't just say a thing. I say one sentence, and then my brain immediately goes, well, is that a universal? I don't think that's a universal. So you might want to check that. It's a disease. Dan, it is a disease that I...
Oh, yeah, yes. Yes. Professionally related habits are terrible. The longer you do something for, the more you find yourself sort of hooked into those little familiar minutiae of things that I find myself sitting and watching television and criticizing the grammar of adverts.
Are there things like this actually affects my life in that I will be talking with my wife or a friend and I will say a thing and I can't just say a thing. I then have to waver on the actual truth content of that thing and sit there. It can't just be a conversation. I then go inwards and have to sit there and weigh it and think about all the other qualifications, and it makes for not all the time. Look, Dan, I can be fun. I want you to know that. I can be fun. But sometimes it makes for a very stilted conversation. Are there things from your professional life that have leaked into your personal life? Not just criticizing the grammar of an advert, but, where suddenly like you're talking to someone and you're like, I don't think that's actually how you would talk, your character.
Oh, yes. I think it's the other way around. I think I often talk like a narrative, in as much as I download too much information into the course of a simple conversation, because I'm thinking, I've got to set the scene, describe what they were wearing and that kind of stuff. I do that all the time. Yes, convoluted explanations for things, where it's like, which as a result means that sometimes I sound as if I'm somehow dishonest, that I'm making something up. And people go, really? And I go, no, I should have just told that in a simpler way. That's sort of, so all the time.
Nope, I get this. It's very familiar. Now, I got a big question. So this, the show, I'm not asking necessarily about the process of writing, but I am curious in terms of Wild's End. Mm-hmm. Now, look, I've been a fan of your work for decades now. Yeah, that's right. Sorry. It's sometimes when I talk to people and I think about when I first encountered their work, and I'm just like, oh wow, I've gotten old.
Yes, so have I. And that's when somebody says, I've been reading your work since I was a kid. And I go, yeah, thanks for that.
I am curious, Wild's End felt personal in some way. And I'm curious if those characters are people you knew when you were a kid, because you're growing up outside Manchester, right?
Maidstone. It's Maidstone.
What is... Okay. That's particularly different. Sorry.
Yes, that is. There's the truth of it. It's particularly different. Yeah, different part of the country. It's essentially outside London, about an hour outside London.
Okay.
It's in the south, yeah.
I'm going to say this. Just your Wikipedia is very wrong.
Oh, yes.
So you're growing up outside London in the 60s and 70s. Are the older versions of those characters there? Because obviously it's set 40 years earlier from when you were...
Yes, I suppose sort of. I mean, I think if Wild's End is one of the things, and I would say it's one of the things that I've written that come across as more personal, it's probably because for a start it's an entirely... creator-owned original piece rather than working in somebody else's universe, which is what I spend most of my time doing. Sort of borrowing characters from Marvel or DC or Warhammer or Doctor Who, whatever it is I'm doing. Whereas Wild's End, like a few things that I write for 2000 AD, entirely created by me or working with the artist. So there's probably more of me in it to begin with because there's more room for me to be there. For a start, it is. I mean, we make in Wild's End we make a great deal of effort to say that it isn't Britain, it isn't England, it's just somewhere that resembles that. We're quite specific about the idea that it's inspired by. So I think, yes, there must be people that I know or have known in there, but I think more it was drawing upon my own childhood in terms of the kind of children's books I read then. The kind of the very comforting things like things like Wind in the Willows or Winnie the Pooh or Rupert the Bear, that sort of thing. It was trying to sort of, I don't know, channel those kind of entirely mythical ideas of sort of bucolic, comfortable, nice surroundings, which buys in, I suppose, to a sort of particularly British nostalgia, because that was the whole idea. It's weird that when Ian, the artist, and I worked on, came up with Wild's End, it wasn't the first thing we'd done together, and we've done other things since, but when we first worked on Wild's End, the idea initially was that the elevator pitch was it was the War of the Worlds meets the Wind of the Willows, by which we meant that comfortable 1920s, 1930s post-Edwardian milieu meets something really horrible. So you got those two very, very kind of British things: the very comfortable rural idyll, and the horrific sort of John Wyndham, Quatermass type invasion story, and that the idea that it was the friction that those two things would cause by meeting would be the interesting part of it. And it was quite late in the project, before we committed, that I can't remember if it was me or Ian suggested it. We went, should we make them anthropomorphic? Should we make them animals to really bring that home? Because they would have worked as humans, as characters. But we thought, actually, take it one step further and really connect to that kind of Rupert the Bear tradition of these are walking, talking animals. Except they don't. They behave like humans, completely like humans. There's nothing sort of Disney-fied about the way they operate. And that would be the kind of weirdness of it, that kind of thing. So to me, the strange thing was that once we committed to that and Ian was drawing it, the anthropomorphic nature of them got the characters and personalities across so much faster, because you instantly could read in the animal that they were what they were.
Yeah.
Which made my job interesting. I suppose I therefore got to the personality and character a lot faster, because I didn't have to do the heavy lifting up front. I could just get straight into them and give them idiosyncrasies of the way they spoke and connected to each other. So it's kind of an invisible effect. You look at the book and you go, right, this is what it is. This is a world where the people are animals and blah blah blah. So there's the superficial level, but underneath that there's an enormous amount of sort of invisible, I suppose, narrative engineering going on that is wordless, which is going, we've communicated this to you very, very simply. You're already in this comfortable space by the time something happens. I don't have to work hard to say, this guy's an okay guy, this guy's a bit cheeky. I didn't have to do it, because it was all there in the way they looked and the way they behaved, and the animal choices that they were.
I was like, I never thought of this before. When you have a creator-owned work, right? Like, when I'm writing a script, I have like an actor in mind, even if that actor is never cast in the thing.
Sure.
Right? Or like a show I just sold, like we sold it with the actors there already, so we could write to them. We knew their personalities and who they were, their comedic personas were, so we could write jokes for them.
Sure.
And I like, and obviously, like, if you're stepping like Guardians of the Galaxy, you kind of have an idea of who these people are from, decades of their character existing. So you can at least step in and be like, all right, well, I want to tweak this or this. But it made me just step back for a second when you were saying that. I was like, oh, right. If it's a creator-owned thing, you are discovering this character as much in the art as you are in the writing.
Yeah. You're making all those decisions completely. I mean, like I said, the majority of the work I've done in the many centuries I've been a writer has been essentially tie-in, work for hire, connecting to an existing IP, that sort of stuff. And there are obvious limitations. There are things you simply cannot do within the structure of those IPs. Which is sometimes really reassuring, because it gives you a lovely focus. You go, right, what's the best story I can tell within those limitations? Because a lot of the work has been done for you. Or you can then, Guardians is a great example, where those were sort of D-list Marvel characters that nobody cared about anymore. They had characters and personalities, they had attributes, and the kind of the trick there, if you like, was going, right, I'm going to make them more like this, or I'm going to make this like this, or I'm going to pair these up in a different way. So there was all sorts of, it was a matter of, I suppose, not rebooting's not the right word, but sort of rearranging them into a way that worked for me and giving them distinctive voices, which are the voices that they've continued to have, which is great, and that's what transferred into the movies and everything like that. But yes, when you're creator owned, you've got the enormous benefit of total freedom because you're world building from scratch. But at the same time, there's that terror of going, oh my God, I've got to build everything from scratch. There's nothing is a given, nothing is preset, I'm not fitting this into anything else. I've got to do all of that, and I've got to create these characters. So when I write it, whether it's novels or comics or whatever I'm doing, like you, I have often cast a character in my mind. Either before I've started to write them, or as I start to write them, I go, oh yeah, if this was a movie, this would be, and it's not to stick to that in a hard and fast way, because I'm not writing for that actor, but I'm writing for that type, so it gives me a sort of handhold that directs me. And sometimes it can be a combination of 2 or 3 people. And then sometimes when I'm asked for reference, for instance, if there's going to be a book jacket illustration, who would this be? And I can give, it's like, well, not a literal version, but this is who I was thinking of, or these are the people, this is the type I was thinking of. So I do that, and I did that, funnily enough, even with Wild's End when they were animals, because I was thinking about what their personalities would be like, who would voice them if it was an animated feature, that kind of stuff. So you do that kind of stuff. But yes, you discover the character on the page, particularly when the artist is going to work and is bringing that to bear. No pun intended. So you get you suddenly realise. So, anyway, let me take a step further backwards from that. So I write a script. The artist, in this case, Ian, draws it. Then I do what's called a dialogue pass, where I adjust it because you go, actually, that line doesn't work anymore because now I can see the face. Literally, I can see the expression. So there's a better line that can come out of that. But also, I can see the personality as it's coming through, and I can adjust the script to suit them even better than it did before, and then I can start to write on beyond that and really dig into that. Now I've found what that is, which is exciting, and that happens in established IPs too. Once an artist is working on the Guardians or Teen Titans or Aquaman or whatever, and you go, actually, the way they're drawing it sounds to me like they'd be more like this, and they'd be a bit, they'd have these mannerisms because the artist is putting that acting in. But even more so on a creator end, there is another series that Ian Culbard and I do for 2000 AD called Brink, which is a kind of police procedural set in space stations in the near future. It's sort of True Detective meets Outland, I suppose. And we had an idea. We hoped it would be successful. We wrote it as a single series of about 20 parts with a view to doing sequels to it, if it was going to be successful. It was. We're now on book 7, I think. I mean, it's a big ongoing major thing. But one of our ideas was that that the main character of the first book would not necessarily be the main character all the way through, that each chapter, each book, would probably shift focus to someone else somewhere else in the same setting so we could explore it more thoroughly. Ian drew the main character, Curtis. She's a female cop. He drew her with such an extraordinary precision. She's incredibly contained. There's virtually no facial expression. She is absolutely internalized. So there's even a silent panel of her, you realise that she is thinking. She's working it all out. She is smart. She's ahead of people, but she doesn't give very much away. Once we had that, by the end of book 1, we went, well, we can't move away from her now, because actually she's made this series her own. It may be called Brink, but it's actually her story, because she's such a permanent fixture in the middle of this story. She's absolutely everything revolves around it. So we then adjusted what we were doing and continued with her and explored via her, because we couldn't walk away from her. If you walked away from her, the strip would have fallen apart because you couldn't replace her with somebody else. So these things happen on the page. I always, when you're doing a comic, for instance, or a book or TV show or whatever, you plan it out, you write your outline, you're doing it so that the editor or whatever is going to be happy with it and will give you permission to begin. Once you've begun, I always say, you do not get all the great ideas you're going to get on that one day where you sat down to write the outline. There will be so many things that happen in the weeks and months that follow that as you go along, and if you're not responding to those things, you're A, not doing the job right, but also you're missing out on all the wonderful stuff that happens 3, 6, 10 weeks down the line where you suddenly go, oh, wait, look, I can do, oh, wait a minute, I can incorporate this, or look what that character's become. Look how they're literally leaping off the page with their vitality, and yeah. So I've always done that. I've done that in novels where I've planned a novel out, 120,000 word novel, been writing it, going yes, and towards the end, this big beat will happen, and I get there and go, no, it's not that after all. 6 months in, it's not this after all. I'm going to make it this instead, and I just run with it.
Okay. So that makes me have to ask you. Is this something you have is this a skill you have gained as you have really learned the craft, or is this spirit in you already when you are a kid? Because I definitely, like, when you're saying this stuff, I remember when I was first starting out doing comedy, I would be doing improv. So in New York, like at UCB and around the city. And I remember, like, I would be in a scene and I want to say a joke, and the time would pass for the joke, but I would be like, well, this is a good joke, I'm going to say it anyway. And it would fall flat because I missed the moment, right?
Yeah.
And then so slowly over the next, 10 years, I'm like, you know what? Jokes are simple. Like, you can... ideas, like, I have new ideas for things every day. So you can... I had a former guest say, like, jokes are like tissues. You take one out of the box, there's always, 300 more in there. You can just keep doing that. And I had to learn, but this is the thing, I had to learn to let go.
Yes.
And to just be like, you know what? Actually, this thing that I'm writing, that I planned, it's actually a completely different thing. And if I really want to honor what I'm writing, I'm going to go with this completely different thing. And it took me a while. So I'm curious, though, but it took me a while to learn that lesson because I was too set in my ways. And I'm curious if it's a lesson you learned or if it's a spirit that you had with you from your life. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, it does absolutely make sense. I think. Well, first of all, I would say that obviously with anything with anything created that has structure, like a script or a novel or something like that, you've got to have, I believe, you've got to have some idea where you're going to go with it. You've got to have some kind of plan. But as they say, no plan survives contact with the enemy. So you've also got to be quick on your feet. I think, in answer to your question directly, that it is a spirit that's always been in me, and the lesson that I learned through professional experience about doing it for years and years and years and years was simply the confidence to deploy that spirit. It wasn't a matter of recognizing it. It was like, it's there. And quite often my gut would say, do this. And I go, no, I've got a plan. And it was the confidence to say, no, this is better. This is what I need to do. And I think that goes back to when I was a kid, my parents were artists, and my favourite occupation when I was a kid was I like to draw and I like to write stories, and I like to read as well, obviously. But it was that. So, and I was sort of, I'm probably no older than about 8 or 9 years old when I sort of discovered comics. And it wasn't that I fell in love with comics because they were a great art form, although they are. It was that I suddenly saw an opportunity where the two things I love the best, drawing and writing, could be done simultaneously and harnessed together. So I would write and draw my own comics. And then later on I would write my own stories. But all of that, absolutely all of that, was improvised. I mean, I didn't know where I was going with these things. It was just like I was a kid sitting down going, oh, I'll do this. Oh, I can do this now, and I can do this. So I had it then. And that was great fun. I also, as a kid, probably about 13 or 14, when I discovered role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons. My friend had Dungeons and Dragons. We did that. I almost always ended up being the dungeon master or the referee. I never really planned a dungeon or a scenario. I would just make it up as I went along. And I think also that storytelling thing came from doing that for years as well. It was just like, what can we do next? What will be fun? What will be interesting? Oh, I've had an idea. I can do that. And like you say, it is a much about seizing on an idea that suddenly struck you because it's been in your head now long enough for things to have made connections that weren't there obvious to begin with. And you go, wait a minute, I now see where that connection is. And having the confidence to go, I'm going to use that instead because that's much better. Just as it is, the inverse of that is, like you say, throwing the tissue away, going, actually, this tissue would have been great 5 minutes ago, but no longer. I'm just going to throw that away. It's not wasted because actually, another 6 months, that will be the 5 minutes will come back. There will be a chance to use it. Nothing is ever really wasted. It's as in comedy, timing is everything. Use the great idea at the right moment. That's the really thing. It's not just a great idea, it's a great idea at the right moment. In the same way that the wrong idea at the right moment, I don't know, that analogy fell apart, but you know what I mean. You know where I'm going with that.
Yes. So, okay, wait, what kind of artists were your parents?
So, they first of all, they both went to art college. They were both art teachers. They worked in the education system over here. My dad was head of the art department at a major school. So my mum particularly was a painter. I think my dad trained as a potter originally, but he was an amazingly good graphic art. I mean, he could paint as well, but he used to draw the most amazing sort of ink sketches, really intricate stuff. He was a model maker as well, and they were both musical. So I was an only. They were only children. I was an only child. Incredibly artistic household, and they taught art, but they. At home, they did their art. That's what they did. That's And my dad, they were part of the folk revival movement in the 60s. So they ran the local folk club. They were both musicians, and they had a little folk group, which I latterly discovered only about 2 years ago had been offered a recording contract, which they'd never taken because it was too scary. It's like, wow. So I grew up in this environment where they were meeting people who were very big at the folk scene there as the booked guest of their club night, whatever it was. And my dad wanted to learn to play the guitar and the banjo. He was interested in that. He loved Pete Seeger. There was Pete Seeger he thought was amazing. But he couldn't afford either of those instruments. So because he was good at woodwork and stuff like that, he made himself a guitar. And then, because he could do a bit of metalwork too, he made himself a banjo. So he made instruments, and and the people coming to the folk club, the guests at the folk club and everything like that, they were so impressed. They went, "That's a great guitar. Where did you get that?" And he goes, "I made it." So he started getting commissions from professional folk singers and bands and stuff like that to make instruments. So he had, through the course of his life, he died 2 years ago. Through the course of his life, he had two careers. He was a school teacher by day, and by night, he was a luthier, that is to say, a maker of stringed instruments. He'd make them one or two at a time, by hand, custom built, and they were always commissioned, and they are now all over the world. I think he made a total of about 1,500 instruments, and they are regarded as some of the finest of their kind. Guitars, a few banjos, occasionally something wild like a hurdy-gurdy or a psaltery or something else, as long as it was stringed. But the main thing he did, and this was in the 70s in the UK, was the Irish music part of the folk revival really hit. So there were bands like, particularly Planxty was the biggest at the time, hugely successful. And Planxty toured, they came to the folk club, all this kind of stuff. And Irish music at the time, folk music at the time, relied on the bouzouki as one of the key instruments because it had the right sound for the thing, based sort of related to the Greek version of the bouzouki. But the bouzoukis were I don't know if this is a long side story, but I'm telling it anyway. Bouzoukis, they didn't have a big body like a big 12-string guitar, so they didn't produce a lot of noise. And of course, it was strictly against the rules to amplifier and this kind of stuff because it was folk music. Goddammit. So the two of the lead members of Planxty talked to my dad and they said, "Can you build us some bouzoukis? Make us some bouzoukis. We'll commission you. But can you see if you can find a way of making them louder?" So with the help of Donald Lunny, who was one of the main members of the band, my dad sort of devised and invented this thing where he put a 3-part wooden back, so it was on like a tortoise shell on the back of the traditionally flat back bouzouki. So it was more like a lute, but with 3 sections. And it made these things immensely loud because it gave it this... And that was the Irish bouzouki. He, with Donald Lunny, invented the Irish bouzouki, which is now played by bands around the world, and that was his great legacy. And a Peter Abnett Irish bouzouki, or they were very they came in different sizes, but the classic bouzouki, mandolins as well, is I would go as far as to say like the Stradivarius of bouzoukis. There's a phrase I didn't expect to say out loud. But yeah, so they were artistic in all sorts of different ways. And you couldn't help, obviously, but be inspired by that going on. So I wrote and drew and did all those things.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's not just a spirit, like an artistic spirit that you grew up with, but it's also a spirit, like an engineering which you can kind of see in the craft of writing a story or a narrative, right? That like there's that engineering in there. Again, it's not this show is never about like easy one-to-one or linear kinds of connections. It's more about the like not to get too heavy, but it's like, very Hegelian. So it's like, what is the spirit you grow up in, and how do you react to that? And it's just like it's the idea of invention that's there that gets into you in a certain way.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if I am referred to when I'm interviewed or people, there's a press article about me or something like that, they always describe me as the prolific Dan Abnett. That's how they talk to me. To such an extent, it's almost I'd thinking about changing my name by default just to prolific, just because that's what everybody calls me, prolific, and I understand why. I am sometimes slightly resentful because there is a sort of disparaging thing to, well, he's prolific, not he's good or not anything else like that, but he's prolific. He writes an awful lot, and I think, well, actually, the only reason I get to write an awful lot for an awful lot of people over the years and have chalked up, sort of 70 novels and ridiculous numbers of comics is because people keep coming back and asking me. So there must be something going on there. But I'll, prolific. Okay, I'll use that. But so I've realised, and people have commented on this, but fellow freelancers, fellow writers, my family, when I see them, which is seldom, you know what I mean? People always say, my God, you work. I mean, you're never not working. You have this extraordinary work ethic. And I think what you've said there is a really good example of that, because I grew up in an incredibly creative, artistic household, which is great because that inspired me to be creative, and and gave me the confidence to just go, yeah, I'm just going to do this because who's going to stop me? But it also, I think, through what my dad was doing, and my mum as well, because she was, always at work on her art and everything like that. I think that taught me the practical application, that it was all very well having great creative ideas, but you also needed the focus to sit down every day and do it and keep doing it. And that way you produce things. You didn't just have great ideas, but there was a product at the end of it, as it were. And I don't mean that in a nasty capitalist way. I mean, there was just something to show for it at the end of it. And that by doing that over and over and over again, you could refine, you could polish, you could improve your own techniques, you could learn new ways of doing things, you could come up with things you weren't expecting to do. And I think maybe that's why, there are other reasons, but maybe that's why that I ended up, when I went freelance as a writer, it was into a lot of existing IPs and tie-in work, because that's the commercial end of the creative writing thing. Mm-hmm. Who are people saying, we need somebody to do this, can you do this? Yes, I absolutely can, because I understand. I can look at it, I can understand it, I can do it, here it is done, boom. So I think that's where I've spent a lot of time over the years, because I like that it's not the... I'm not a sitting in a garret lonely waiting for inspiration to strike type artist, and not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm a kind of what's on the list today? How can I do it? I've got 4 hours, right? I've got to, and that's the way I do it. And I am absolutely unashamed of that kind of practical approach to something that ought not to be able to be measured practically. If you see what I mean?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Sorry, I'm in my head now, and I'm just like, no, because I was thinking about that, like the IP thing, where like I remember I was asked to pitch. It was like a how-to book that they were trying to. Again, this is Los Angeles, so like literally trying to wring profit out of every molecule of anything that's ever been written. It was like some how-to book, and I was like, you know what? Sure, fine. I guess I'll try it. And I was like, oh, okay, I know what to do here. Like I sat down, and I'm like, oh, okay, so it was like The Nerd's Guide to Dating or something. I forget what it was exactly, but I'm like, oh, okay, I know this character is kind of this person I knew, this character, and I know how to like draw a narrative out of this. And I sat down and I had written a pitch. No one ever did anything with it, by the way. I did all this work for free. And no one ever even took anyone else's pitch. It just dissolved into the ether. But like, I get that idea of just like, yes, here I have this skill, I have this craft and this work ethic on top of that I saw in my parents when I was a kid, and then kind of got into my bones. Like, is there a pleasure that you get from that work ethic?
God, no, absolutely is. I don't think I could have sustained it for as long as I have if I didn't also enjoy just you know, if I don't, I sort of work office hours these days. I used to work long into the night and work until I was asleep, and then get up late, and I thought I was a night owl. It turns out I'm not. About 10 years ago, I was diagnosed with. It's over 10 years now. Goodness me! But I was diagnosed. I had suffered a number of seizures.
Oh.
Shockingly, and it was like, what the heck's going on here? And after a stay in hospital and some tests, they discovered that I was epileptic. I'm an epileptic. But what's more interesting, they said, but you've always been epileptic. You just didn't know you were epileptic. I had previously suffered what's called nocturnal epilepsy, which means that you have fits in your sleep, which I'd never known about, although as a kid I'd had these terrible recurring night terrors that now I realise were that. And at this point in my life, they'd finally surfaced and were happening in daylight hours, and therefore were visible to me and anybody around me in a terrifying sense. So the diagnosis was it's just epilepsy. Here, take these pills, you'll be fine. So and that could lead us into a whole weird conversation about consciousness and creative perception, which I suddenly realised was strongly related to my sort of pre-ictal states of epilepsy, which I had never realised were there before. So there's all sorts of weird things going on there. But anyway, the point is, at that point, I had to sort of clean my act up. I couldn't stay up late because you couldn't get tired. Because if you were tired, it lowered the threshold, made a seizure more likely. So I started to go to bed at a sensible hour, and I would wake up early. And at that point, in a comparatively late point in my life, really, to discover this, I went, oh my God, I'm a morning person. I didn't realise I was... So I get up every day feeling, I sleep really well, I wake up really early, I'm refreshed, I am so eager to go, and I sort of start work sort of 5-6 o'clock in the morning, and I work through to about 6 o'clock, and at that point, no matter what I'm doing, I don't go, oh, just a bit more. I go, right, that's it, that's the end of the day. I get a walk off, I close the door behind me, and I come back to it the following day. And I take weekends off now, which I never used to do. I used to be that kind of freelance mentality of I must do any work in any space that is available to me, and that is like, well, that's you don't get a social life, you don't get a family life, you don't get any of those things. It's also unhealthy because it burns you out. So I stick to those copious hours, but if I go for more than a couple of days, 3 or 4 days without sitting down at the desk or writing something, I sort of get withdrawal symptoms. I like that process so much. So I love the creativity. The creativity is the most important part of it. It kind of nourishes or rewards some part of me that is possibly too deeply set to be subject to analysis, but also the actual practical act of getting on with things, and sitting at my desk and just working away and producing stuff and being prolific is pleasurable to me. Otherwise I couldn't do it. The number of and this applies to writers and artists. I'm obviously working in the comic industry for a long time. Worked with and alongside so many different people, and the recurring problem that people seem to have is the stamina to keep going. They often say, "How do you keep doing that?" And I think, how do you do it day after day after day? I'm sick of it. I know some really talented writers, for instance, who actually don't like the process of writing. They write for a living, but they don't like writing. And I'm going, how is that possible?
Yep, I know exactly what you're saying.
People getting cabin fever, artists getting cabin fever, or going stir crazy for being in their room too long. And I'm going, and they go, how do you do it? And I'm thinking, well, I've come to the conclusion that I must be very strange, because my question to them would be, how do you not get that pleasure from that process?
Yes,
you know what?
Yes. Okay. So my wife is a stand-up and a writer and an actor. Okay, and she when she's writing, she is miserable. She is miserable. She will write on stage when she does stand up. She loves acting. She likes you hear this a lot, right? She likes the act she likes having written, right? She likes having a thing. Yeah. She likes having the idea. She likes having the thing afterwards. But the process of writing for her, it just makes her miserable. Whereas I can sit here in my office I can come in here after having fed the animals and given them all their various medicines and just sit down, and it is okay, except for the fact of having to write a pitch doc. I will say the pitch doc part is not the fun part, but the script writing I could do it for like you lose time. It's one of those like you like fall into the flow of existence, right?
Yeah, I absolutely go into the zone, which I think is we joke about. My wife and I joke about the zone. She's actually writes too, but she also doesn't like the process. So when she writes something, it's like 3 weeks of hell while she gets it done. You know? Whereas I'm there every day, and we talk about me being in the zone, which I think, incidentally, is a sort of almost meditative trance-like state that is not a million miles away from an epileptic fugue. It's I go in there somewhere and do something, but yeah, time disappears, and that is brilliant. And you know what you were saying earlier on about the right moment for the right idea and throwing the tissue away. That kind of the idea that it's sometimes you've got to know when not to. That's the other thing, is one day in, I don't know, every 2 or 3 weeks, I'll just sit at my desk in the morning. I might be all fired up to go, and I'll sit there and go, no, nothing's happening today. And then, and for years, I would then go, no, you must stay here and keep going with it. And I'd end up having a miserable day where I produce nothing. So I've learned to sort of to recognise the telltale signs of those rare days where it just isn't going to happen. And then I go, right, what am I going to do today instead? And it could, I'll just go and do something, hopefully that will perhaps inspire me, or there'll be some sort of connection to something will feed in there. It's the same as getting stuck. I'm whether we could debate the merits or indeed existence of writer's block, but to me, if I'm ever stuck on something where I can't get it to work, if I go and do something else, which could include writing something different, working on a different project, the problem solves itself when I'm not looking.
Yes.
Yes.
Yep. I take the dog for a walk, and as I take the dog for a walk,
suddenly
somehow,
it's like,
inevitably,
why was that? It was, so obvious. It was so obvious, and I spent 15 minutes staring at this, and it wasn't working. So suddenly,
I remember
those sorts of things.
Getting a terrible note on a pilot that from a couple years ago that we had sold, my wife and I, and I was like, I don't know what to do with this note, because we have to take this note. This is from an executive, and we're not powerful enough to say, nope, not doing it. I don't know how to do this. I went and saw a movie. The movie didn't inspire me at all. I don't remember the movie being very good at all. But while watching it, the stuff in the back of my head did whatever it did, and I came out being like, I know what to do. Now I know how to.
And what it was doing was it was unclenching. That you kind of clench up when you're thinking really hard about something, and if you just stop, that sort of part of the brain relaxes, and suddenly the synaptic connections, I think, are working, and they're working randomly without you trying to guide them or force them or direct them. And it's the same. I find the same thing in all sorts of work, inspiration, for instance, when I. Thinking about a project and thinking about the sorts of things I want to look at or watch or read that will get me into that mindset, or what do I need to learn more about, what do I need to research, and that kind of stuff. And I will often go into a library or a bookshop, or even the bookshelves in this house, and I will look around looking for a particular book, and I can pretty much guarantee that it won't be the book I'm looking for that stops me. It'll be something apparently unrelated that makes me go, oh, wait a minute, and then suddenly there's something in that is the perfect thing, because it's those kind of lateral or diagonal connections. It's the slightly unexpected ones where you get you're writing a book on I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, but being too specific and focused pinches you up too much, and then you go, actually, it was this thing right next to it that was the thing that really mattered. That's what's going to give me the in to this story, or this character, or this world, or this thing that I need to know. So I've taught myself to be kind of receptive to that kind of muse, whatever it is.
Yes. Were you receptive to the universe in this sense it's not new agey. I don't really mean it in a new agey sense, but like, were you receptive when you were younger, when you were a kid, when you were growing up? Like, did you allow this stuff in, or were you more pinched?
No, I absolutely think I did. I think I was encouraged to. I think that was one of the great sort of gifts my parents gave me, and various teachers at school. I was encouraged to do that, and I sort of didn't think at the time, certainly, that I was doing anything that anybody else wasn't doing. Do you know what I mean? I just thought that's how you reacted to things. So that, you were, an interesting thing took you to another interesting thing, and tangential connections and that kind of creative association of stuff was that's what I did as a kid. I think I played with. As a kid, I played with the sort of toys that kids play with. But I never played with them in the way I suppose that they were intended to be played. So it wasn't just like, oh, today I'm playing with my Lego bricks and tomorrow I will get out my box full of toy cars. It was like, no, they're happening both at once. My mind will invent a reason why this toy and this toy can go together. And toys themselves, which I've always been fascinated by, I think are great because they are actually sort of instruments of imagination. You sort of the whole point is not to collect them and put them on shelves, which sadly I do sometimes. But the point is that they are there's something wonderfully specific about a toy in as much as it's only there to make you think about things. It's only there to make you imagine what that thing is and what might be invisibly around it in the play that you're making in your head. And that kind of stuff, and that fascination has always been there too. So I guess that kind of creative improvisation, also came from just playing.
Yes. Did you ever lose that spirit and then have to find it again, or was that spirit allowed to flourish within you and grow? Because I ask that because there are a lot of guests that I have, and I even see this I kind of saw this in myself a little bit, that spirit of play got away from me, and I had to recapture it again in my late 20s.
I have seen that. Actually, I guess again I'm lucky that I don't think it ever really did. I think I've always had it there because I didn't think of it as being anything particularly unusual. It was just the way my mind worked. It does happen on a very short-term basis every now and then, where I just feel, like I said, uninspired and nothing's happening. But then that's just probably I've worked too hard or I'm tired, or it's just one of those days where it's not going to work and you just know better to back off and leave it alone and come back when it's feeling better. But I have seen that. I think it was more through my teens and I suppose college years and stuff like that is not really appreciating how much I could use that. I sometimes, if I have a regret at all, as I look back at, when I was a kid, I produced tons of comics and stories and stuff like that because it was the fun thing that I did. But I think inevitably when you're at school and at college you've got work to do, so you do less of that kind of stuff. But sometimes I look back and go, I wish I'd done more of that then, because it didn't seem like there was time to do that, but actually there was huge amounts of time to do that because it's not the other thing I was supposed to be doing, and it would have been a wonderful contrast. So I sometimes look back at the sort of imaginary novels that I never wrote when I was 16, and thinking, why you could have done? Why didn't you do that? So I think I was lucky enough to land in the comics industry first of all as a starting point, which was a creative environment where we were being encouraged to do these things pretty early on. I mean, straight out of university that I did that, and I was a comic book writer for the best part of a decade. That's what I did. Until I wanted to write other things. I wanted to write novels. I wanted to write prose. I wanted to write all sorts of other different things. But I wrote what I was given the opportunity to write because it was also my job. And there came a point where I was asked by somebody who was already employing me to write comics. They said, we're thinking about doing prose fiction. Do you want to have a go at that? And I went, absolutely. And that's where suddenly I became a novelist alongside. And rather than that taking over from the comics dying away, I love the comic form so much because it's a very different way of telling a story, that I just started to wear both hats and do them side by side. And then about 5 or 10 years later like that, somebody from a games company came along and said, would you like to write games? And I went, oh yeah, well, I don't know much about them. And they said, it doesn't matter, you know about story. So suddenly I got a third hat to wear. And I now, my working life is I've got all of those different things happening at the same time. I've got multiple projects on the go, and I not only move between them to keep my brain sharp, but I do it in the course of a single day. So I might get up in the morning and go, right, I've got to write that next episode of that comic script this morning, and then this afternoon I'll write a chapter of the book or whatever. So I never stay put so long that I'm going, I hate this book and everything about it.
Okay. So it's like the bureaucratic world never impinged upon your creative world. In other words, like, I think what happens to a lot of guests, or what happened to me a little bit, was that as I got older, suddenly I have to make decisions about how am I going to pay the bills. And the creative stuff, at least for me, it was never like, well, if you pursued this and you got good at this, there's a possibility at least that you could. It was like, no, you have to have you have to do something that will assuredly pay the bills, and that means the bureaucratic world now crashes into your imaginary existence. And it seemed like that didn't happen to you.
It didn't, and that was purely happenstance and accident, really. I think because I absolutely knew that by the time I left university, I would need to get a job because I would need to have an income and I need to do those sorts of things. And I also understood that any aspirations I had to be creative were probably not going to pay terribly well if they did at all for a while. That maybe if I wanted to be a writer, for instance, that would be something that I had to do in my copious free time whilst I held down a day job. So, I mean, it still astonishes and saddens me that there are so many, for instance, novelists whose work I regard incredibly highly and are regarded as well-known, successful novelists who still have to hold down a job in order to be able to support that. So I grew up, when I was a kid growing up, I thought art was my thing rather than writing. And I thought I would, like my parents, I would go to art college, I would study art, and I would become either an artist or an art teacher, which I didn't see as a fallback position. It was like teaching art, that's great. Nothing, I'm obviously a big supporter of the teaching profession. And when I was at school, I had a series of really great English teachers who pointed out to me at various points that I was actually quite good at handling English and, perhaps could think about that as an alternative to art. Not that I was bad at art, but, here's an academic subject you might want to consider rather than going to art college. You might want to go to university. I had one in particular who said, have you ever thought about it? And I went, no, I haven't. And he goes, but when you study English language and literature, you're really, really good. You could pursue that. And it was only because of his suggestion, I'd never thought of that before in my life, that he said, if you're interested in that, I will support you and I will show you what you could do and I will, help you. So I ended up sort of almost unexpectedly and at the last minute switching tracks and deciding to read English at university rather than go to art college, because I realised, I suppose, intuitively at that point that I could write better than I could draw. Do you know? Or rather, I could create the things I wanted to create better and faster by writing them than by drawing them. So that was the big thing. Drawing takes a long time. If you want to draw a story in comic book form, it's going to take a long time. But writing a story, that creative fullness, it happens faster in writing terms. So I took his advice and he supported me getting into, well, again, not only getting into university to read English, which is something I hadn't until 3 months before even thought about doing that, but he put me in for the Oxbridge entrance exam and got me into Oxford. I did not expect to do that. And so every step I took was sort of like really useful and brilliant, but also unexpected. It wasn't quite where I guess I was open to that weird suggestion of what is connecting, what's happening, and I will just, is this the path now? Okay, this is what the path is going to be. So when I left university, I thought, well, I'm going to be an English teacher then. Obviously, that's what I'm going to do instead, because I now have a degree in English rather than a qualification in art. So I will teach English. That's great. And I stumbled into the comics industry absolutely by chance, because during my university career, I had done sort of cartoons and comics for the college magazine. And somebody had said to me jokingly, knowing that I like comics, they said, you should get a job in comics. Now, I've been reading comics since I was 8 or 9 years old. It never really occurred to me that was an industry that existed with people in it who were doing it professionally, producing these comics. I don't know where I thought they come from, but, it's just... So I went, oh, all right then. So on that, just prompted by that, I wrote to Marvel. I wrote to their London office, Marvel UK. They were basically reprinting a lot of the American material for the UK market. And I just wrote to them and said, I'm interested in comics and I'm just finishing my degree now and blah, blah, blah. And they invited me to visit them in London. So I went, oh, great, this will be a nice day out. I'll get to look around the offices. Wow, cool. Look around Marvel's offices. Of course, who wouldn't want to do that? So I went down there and I arrived and there was a room full of other candidates. What I hadn't realised was that they were advertising for an editorial trainee position in the national press and they thought I was applying for the job. So I arrived and found myself like, well, you can either leave now or go through with the interview. And I went, oh, all right, I'll go through with the interview, and got a staff job as an editorial trainee at Marvel about 3 months after leaving university, by a series of misadventures that I couldn't possibly have replicated if I'd tried. So I started on staff in the colour separation department, and literally as a paste up and editorial. This was pre-desktop. Desktops existed, mind you, but Marvel UK, it was pre-desktop. Everything was done old school, and I learned all those things. And I learnt from the editors I was working with, who were all brilliant. How storytelling works and panel composition and all those sort of rules and regulations, which are guidelines rather than fast rules, but all the basic rules of putting a comic together. I knew how to. I could put a comic together. I could commission it. I could do it. And they encouraged us to. The pay was awful, by the way. So they encouraged us to do freelance in whatever skill set we had. So several people worked as colorists, several people worked as letterers, or whatever. But they encouraged us all to write stories. Just so that we had the experience of writing a story. If we were going to edit a freelance writer on a story, it'd be better have had the experience of ourselves to know what that was like. And I obviously jumped at that chance. And Marvel UK at that time was predominantly licensed material. It was Thundercats and Transformers and Action Force, which is G.I. Joe, and Thomas the Tank Engine and the Mr. Men and all sorts of things like that, nursery and junior comics. So I just started writing, and once I'd written I wrote a script on spec in the weekend and handed it into my editor and said, "Is that any good?" And it came back covered in red marks, and they went, "Actually, we'll buy it, but look at the notes." And from that point on, I just wrote whatever I got a chance to write. So I wrote all these characters. So again, I'd accidentally ended up doing the creative thing, but getting paid for it, which is something that is a break that people don't often get. And after a few years of doing that, though I loved the editing work and I loved being in the office environment, I realised that what I really wanted to do was write. And so I sort of quit my day job and carried on with my freelance work, and that's what I've done ever since. And because in those days in Marvel UK, it was all those licensed products. It was kids' IPs and stuff like that. It was Sylvanian Families and Galaxy Rangers or Real Ghostbusters or whatever. That's also where I learnt to very rapidly and effectively understand an IP really quickly, so that I could focus what I was doing, and that skill set is what then I took elsewhere to things that are effectively grander. The Marvel universe, the DC universe, Warhammer, Doctor Who, they're all big IPs. They have more things to learn, but they're still IPs. You still have to understand the limitations in order to write for it. And I think that's why when in the occasions I get to do something that is creator owned or originated by me, there is that slight sense of fear, because you're going, oh my God, no one's already written the rules for me. I've got to work them out for myself, which is the great thing, the great fun of doing something like Wild's End or Brink.
Okay, we're getting towards the end. I want to sew up some of these things because I'm very curious. That decision you made where you're like, well, I can write faster, right?
Yeah.
Was it just that, and obviously I'm like condensing a process probably that took a while into like one thing, but like in your mind, if you can remember, was it this like, I have so many ideas, I don't know what to do with them, here's the best way of dealing with all of these ideas, writing, because I can get more out like that? Or was it more, well, I just don't know, like, what was it in that decision where you're like, there is something about the speed of this that is appealing to me?
I think, well, actually, I know exactly what you're talking about. I think, well, first of all, quite clearly, in comics, for instance, as a writer, I can write a script that goes, panel 1, the X-Men, the Avengers, and the Fantastic Four walk down the street towards us. Okay?
Right.
It takes a little bit longer for the artist to draw that. Okay?
Yeah.
An artist at best is producing a page of artwork a day, and it's painstaking. So literally, you can write a story even in script form, faster than you can draw it. And I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of artists do end up getting cabin fever. And obviously there's an immense amount of storytelling in what they're doing, that before it sounds like I'm denigrating what the artist is bringing to a comic, which I'm really not. But I also realised that when I was doing it for myself, when I was writing and drawing my own comics as in my early teens, I was an okay artist. I mean, I was a decent enough artist. And I think if I'd stuck to it and dedicated myself to that particular god, I probably would have reached a decent level where maybe I could have made a go at it. But I was always aware that it was slow, and my mind was filled with the ideas about the characters and the story. And it was like, well, I've now got to show that. How do I, And it was so it was a different kind of practicality. Yep. And I sometimes I would draw sort of fake issues of my own, of the comics that I had created. So it'd be like, I'm on to issue 3 of this thing now. But I found after a while I was sort of arbitrarily and within my own imaginative fiction, sort of just sitting down and going, right, I'm going to write issue 67 of this. Previous 66 issues did not exist in any form, way, shape or form, simply so I could have fun drawing and writing an episode later on in a story, because I was never going to get there under my own steam. And once I realised that, and once I made that comparison of going, writing an art, and also I think being very, very realistically critical of my own ability to draw, that I made that comparison. But the other thing, and this is the other really important thing, is that I would not pass judgment on my own ability to write. But the important thing is that I really love the process of writing. Literally writing fictional script or dialogue or whatever it is gives me more creative pleasure than drawing the same thing. And I recognised that age 15, 16. And that was the deciding factor that helped make those decisions happen.
That is marvelously self-aware. It really is. It really is. Because, like,
well, I was an only child and I had no one to talk to, so...
But you could have, like, that thing could have also, like, blocked you off. Like, you could have lived in your imagination and not thought about...
Yes.
Right? Do you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't necessitate that you would actually be able to think through these kind of existential decisions. But you did.
I did. And I think in my defense, that I did not consider them to be massive existential decisions, or that I was subjecting myself to clever scrutiny and self-analysis. I was just making value judgments about what I liked and what I didn't like as much, or what I thought I was good at and what I didn't think I was quite as good at, and what would please me to do those things. And like I said, most of it was accident, but both those decisions and the situations that I stumbled into, they were kind of accidental. And once I was there, it's like that, you know, flying by the seat of your pants way of writing a story, which essentially is what I like to do anyway. That idea that 3 months into something, you can go, wait a minute, I've got a better idea about where this is going. And I was doing that to my own life as much as I would do to the plot of a structure of a novel. I was just going, wait a minute, 3 months in, hang on, this is better than that idea that I had back then. You know, wouldn't being a professional comic writer be a much more satisfying ending to this plot than training to be an art teacher? I mean, it was that sort of thing. Again, without that sense of self-scrutiny, I didn't realise that's what I was doing, but it's exactly the same sorts of things that I was doing with that I do when I apply to myself to work.
Oh, okay. That makes so much sense. I have like 100 questions, but I just want to end with this one, I think. Because I don't want to keep you too long. Because you said this earlier, and it really piqued my interest when you were talking about, I don't remember the exact terminology you used, but that you linked creativity with kind of the state that you are sometimes in pre-epileptic seizure. I don't remember exactly. And that really, there's something like when I'm in a liminal state, I sometimes have amazing ideas. Like, I don't know what is going on in my brain that allows me, like, as I'm either falling asleep or coming out of sleep.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's what you're talking about, if that's the same thing.
I think they are very related states. That sort of hypnagogic state, I certainly do that. When I'm going to sleep and waking up in the morning, then all sorts of... There's a kind of... looseness, a sort of fluidity to what's going on in my mind, because I haven't made everybody stand by their beds at that point, and it's like all my thoughts are just milling about all over the place, and you make those connections and they're all happening, which is fantastic. With epilepsy, I have discovered there are some extraordinary things that happen. Epilepsy comes in very, very different forms. Mine is not, for instance, photoreceptive. I'm not triggered by lights, but I am triggered by loud noises. And I realised once it started happening to me that my seizures were presaged by a smell, that my smell sensors would go off, and I could smell a smell that wasn't there, and that indeed did not exist in reality. It was a very distinctive smell, which I ended up describing as the smell of my own head, the inside of my own head. But I could smell this thing, and I'd go, "Oh God, here we go!" And that was the trigger. That was me knowing what was happening. But once I had. But the states of... So when you wake up from a seizure, can't even remember for about 5 minutes who you are, what happened, or how you got there. And then, again, it's that hypnagogic state of things have not quite gone back to the way they are, making those kind of connections, which is exactly that. And it's a blissfully wonderful creative state to be in. I'm sure you would agree that that's a great... So many great ideas come out of that weird state that with any luck you can scribble them down in a notebook. and hopefully it's not going to wake up in the morning and look at the thing and go, "What is a glove?" No, I don't know why. I don't know why. I can't remember the context. But once I had been diagnosed and I knew what I was dealing with, and they put me on essentially a series of different anticonvulsant medications, which is the basic way you treat it to stop it happening. And I finally found the one that suited me, which I've been on ever since. And after about 6 months, I went back to see the specialist because they needed to monitor me and make sure it was all working out. And they said, they said to me, and I found this is the bit that I found absolutely amazing. They said, he asked me questions. He said, "Have you had any seizures?" I said, "No, I haven't." And I said, "Right, have you noticed anything else?" And he said, "Have you been suffering from déjà vu?" And I said, "Well, yes. All through my life, I have had a strong recurring sensation of déjà vu, and also of bizarre synchronicity. So weird coincidences and things linking up in ways that it seems that I'm aware of." And he went, and I said, "It's been even more intense. The déjà vu has been even more intense since the diagnosis and since I went on the meds." And he goes, "Oh," he said, "that's really interesting." He said, "In that case, you are still suffering from seizures. You're having micro seizures. We've got the medication to a certain level which has blocked the full-on seizures, the grand mals and everything like that. But you're actually still having these seizures because déjà vu and that sense of the synchronicity is part and parcel of that." And this mattered a lot because, of course, you're not allowed to drive for a year and after a seizure. So I'd lost my driving license. So we had no car in the family, and I wanted to get my license back. And he said, "Well, I'm afraid you've got to go for another year because if you want to drive again, we've got to slightly increase your medication so that we can calm that down, so you're not having the micro seizures, because at the moment you couldn't drive." So I did that, and eventually got my license back a year later. But the interesting question he asked me at the time, we said, "Do you want me to?" He said, "Because quite clearly you're completely stable, you're suffering this déjà vu, and you're really enjoying it." And he said, "Do you want me to increase the medication so that you can drive, or do you want me to leave it there?" And I said, "Well, can you leave me there?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "A lot of people who come to me in this situation ask to be left there because there's this wonderful sense of nostalgia, déjà vu, coincidence, and they say, as long as I'm healthy and safe here, I would like to stay here, please." And he said that you'd be surprised how many people ask to remain there. And they will sacrifice the ability to drive a car or whatever for the chance to do that. And I took the choice because it was important. I was the only driver in the family, so it was important. And I like cars too, but anyway. But even so even once the medication was up to the right level and my déjà vu calmed the hell down, I still get it from time to time, and it's not a micro seizure, but I am clearly that's the way my brain is wired, to see these kind of connections, these kind of creative overlays, these sort of morphic resonances, whatever you want to call it, that are happening around me, and also be responsive to them in a way that I can do something about. And I just think that experience suggested that the detached or otherly state of a seizure, in both in its lead-in and its wind-out, the pre- and post-ictal states and everything like that, has a kind of, what word should we use? Hallucinatory or visionary or connective thing. I imagine it's the sort of altered state that people get into when they take strong mushrooms or something like that. It's that kind of, it's got that feel to it. And I'm thinking, well, if my brain has always been wired like that, no wonder that creativity is going somewhere. So I actually have come to believe that the state of my brain, my epileptic brain, which has always been there, is tied quite closely to the fact that I have been a creative in a...
Yeah. And none of these things on their own perhaps push you in a certain direction, right?
No.
But all of them together,
yeah.
I don't want to say like maybe overdetermined, but definitely like, hey, like it's like a neon sign being like, what about this? What about doing this for your life?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. I mean, traditionally, historically speaking, epileptic people have always been regarded as I suppose special. They've always been the people that the community or society or tribe or whatever has looked after. They're considered to be visionary and sort of touched by God. That there was something special about them, and a lot of very creative people have been epileptic. So it's not. It's weird that it's weirdly good that there isn't a strong stigma attached to it. That is as if people sort of somehow intuitively understood that those people were having some kind of occasional gift insights into something that were, post or pre-mundane or whatever, that there was something going on like that. And I would not dignify my own mind or state with in those kind of terms of being some kind of, yes, I am a visionary prophet bringing you the wisdom of my experience. It's not that at all. But I do know that it's an intrinsic part of my mental mechanism, that even subdued, it's an intrinsic part of the way my brain works and the way that I make those kind of choices about, to ditch a plot halfway through or to throw the tissue away, whatever it is, whatever that analogy is. That's sometimes that it's the gut feeling that something is right or that something is wrong and you've got to do something to change it.
Dan, what an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I hope I haven't rambled on stupidly for too much time.
Not a second, not 1 second. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye.